We're going to be in Ruth chapter 2, and we learn a lot of stuff in chapter 2 that is important not just for the storyline in the book of Ruth, but it has a lot of importance as far as Messiah is concerned. So we'll talk about some of those things as we go through, but here are the three areas that we're going to kind of center in on. Number one is God's wisdom, the way that he set things out for the Israelites to live, how wise it was and how well it worked. Secondly, Ruth's willingness to do work, to put in the effort to take care of her and Naomi. Since Naomi had brought her along from Moab, you've got an older woman with her daughter-in-law, and the daughter-in-law really picks up the slack and wants to do things to make sure that they are okay. And finally, the concept of a Kinsman Redeemer. And that's the part that's really important in New Testament thought, that when you're at your very lowest, when you're about to lose it all, that someone can step in and fix the situation on your behalf. Not for themselves, but so that you can continue, so that you will be okay. And so the idea of the Kinsman Redeemer shows up in Ruth in the person of Boaz, and we'll talk a little bit about him tonight as well. But those are the three major things we want to look at, and we're going to just kind of work our way slowly through chapter 2. So if you'll go to chapter 2, verse 1, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So we get an introduction to the man before we actually encounter him. But Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. So we find out that she's got a relative named Boaz, and then just by sheer happenstance, it just happened to work out that Ruth ends up gleaning in the fields of Boaz. So from the area of God's wisdom, how to take care of the poor. Now, Naomi and Ruth are not just kind of poor at this point. They're among the super poor. They still own a possession, but that possession is at risk. They're going to have to sell it to survive. When they got back from Moab, neither of them has a husband anymore, and the other son has died. By the way, it took me a while to figure it out, but it says it in 17 pitch in my Bible, that Ruth is the widow of Mahlon. So Mahlon was her husband, not Chilion. I didn't have that straight in my mind until just looking at it. But so Mahlon is dead, Chilion is dead, Elimelech is dead, and you've just got these two women who have nothing with which to make a living at this point. They do still own the family property. Now, when God gave the inheritances to the different tribes and they divided them up among the clans, one of the things that God wanted to make sure of was that each family would always have an heir. So if you died not leaving an heir, then the closest relative to you would marry and have children for you. So when you have a piece of land and you purchase the land and there is an outstanding individual, a person who is not married, whose husband has died, didn't leave any children, so there's no one to inherit this land, then it was your responsibility to make an heir that would eventually inherit the land. They had what was called the Year of Jubilee. It was every 50 years. In the 50th year, all the stuff went back to its original owner. So if you bought something in year 49, next year you're giving it back. If you bought something in year 1, you've got it for 49 years, and then it's going to go back to the family. That was God's design, to make sure that all of these families didn't lose their belongings. Everybody had an equal opportunity to hang on to to their land holdings. Okay? So God's wisdom is in evidence here. When she goes to glean behind these harvesters, she is in a place of safety. She doesn't really know that yet, but she's in a place of safety, and she's given the right to pick up what they leave behind. Her job for the day is to follow them as they are gleaning. Now, they're not in combines, right? They're doing this by hand with sickles. They would get a big bunch of the grain stalks, cut them off, bind them up, and carry them. By Jewish law, you had to leave part of your harvest unharvested. Right? You had to leave part of it so that the poorest of the poor could come into your field and follow your harvesters and pick stuff up off the ground. Right? You didn't gather it up in big baskets and carry it to their house, but you left it laying on the ground, and people were allowed by law to come in and to pick up behind the harvesters. So what Naomi and Ruth have decided is that Ruth will go follow a group of harvesters because they are the poorest of the poor, and they're in a situation where they are about to lose all of their inheritance. The man of standing, Boaz, who is fairly wealthy, he's got things going on, he's doing okay, is where she ends up gleaning in his field. All we know about him so far is that he is a close relative. It's going to work out really, really well for Ruth and for Naomi that he is a close relative of theirs. And again, if you didn't know better, you'd think all of this happened by accident. But God's hand is obviously in this. Let's keep reading. In verse 4, just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in any other field. Don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after those women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled." At this she bowed down on her face to the ground, and she asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes? Why have you noticed me, a foreigner?" And Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people that you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of even one of your servants." So we find out a couple of more things. We find out what Boaz knows about Ruth. He knows that she is kind-hearted. She's been very good to her mother-in-law. Now, the other girl, Orpah, went back home. We don't know anything negative about her, right? She seems to have been a good girl. They seem to have had a good relationship. But eventually, she decides to stay in her own culture in Moab, and she goes back home. But Ruth will not part from Naomi. She comes with her, and now she's got the responsibility of taking care of her mother-in-law. So she's going out to the field, and she came out to the field early in the morning, and she works until late in the evening. And I love the way that Boaz welcomes her as part of the Israeli community. He says, "May you richly be rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Isn't that beautiful? This guy's got some heart. I like Boaz. He pronounces a blessing on her, and he gives her a couple of things that she needs to think about. Okay, so here's what Ruth knows about Boaz. He's more kind than she would have expected him to be. She's from out of town. She doesn't know anybody in the field, much less the owner of the field. And then suddenly, this owner of the field comes to check on her to make sure that she's okay. And he's very protective of her. Did you notice in, verse 9? I've told the men not to lay a hand on you. Isn't that interesting? I've told the men not to lay a hand on you. Make sure that you stay in this field. Don't go glean in any other fields. That's verse 8. Run over to verse 22 real quick. And this is what Naomi adds at the end of this conversation. There's not a verse 22. Hang on a minute. What did I do? Oh, okay. It disappeared. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It's good for you, my daughter, to go with the women to work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So these people who are so poor are having to go out and follow folks around and glean in their fields, and it's legal for them to do it, but they may be at risk while they're doing it. So you've got a bunch of guys who are out working. There's two things that this might be insinuating. One, it might be insinuating that the men would just bodily throw her out, that you're not supposed to be here, we're not letting you stay. And the other possibility is that these men who are out working in the fields would take advantage of her. So neither scenario is good, and the fact that Boaz comes to her and says, "You stay in my field, and I have told my workers to make sure that you're okay. So follow the women in my field." So she finds out that he is a stand-up guy. Right? She doesn't know anything about him. She doesn't even really know that she's kind of, in an off kind of way, related to the guy. She just knows that here's a man that is going to make sure that she's okay. Keep reading, verse 14. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "You come over here. Have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some of the stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. And don't rebuke her." Oops, accidentally dropped one. Oh, well, that's okay. You pick it up. Okay. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town. Her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz." And so all of a sudden, Naomi understands. But here's some of the things that we learn from this. Their impression of each other, Boaz and Ruth, is reinforced throughout the day. Boaz keeps trying to do nice things for Ruth. Leave her a little bit of extra grain. Don't get on to her if she kind of gets in your way. Just make sure that she gets everything that she needs. And Boaz understands that it's not just a matter of law, it's a matter of grace. Right? So he's making sure that she gets not just what she deserves or what the law demands that he gives her, but he's given her grace. He's given her mercy. He's given her kindness. So she recognizes that. And he sees that Ruth puts in a mammoth day's work. I mean, this girl's been out there all day. When he first arrives, he asks, "Well, who does this young lady belong to?" And their answer is, "Well, we don't really know, but she showed up." They did know that she belonged to Naomi, but we don't know much about her. But she's been working since she got here, and she's only taken a brief break the whole day. So she works all afternoon after lunch. Then she gets all this grain, and she doesn't just drag the grain home. She's got to make sure she gets it all cleaned. And so she gets all of this flour together, all of the grain that she has cleaned, and it's about 30 pounds. That's pretty impressive stuff. And when she gets all of this together, plus the food she had left over from her meals that Boaz gave to her, she takes that back home and shows Naomi, and Naomi is impressed. What a wonderful young lady she has living in her home. Boaz is impressed. What a wonderful young lady he has met in his field that day. And it never mentions what she looks like. Do you notice that? There's never a mention of, well, Ruth was easy on the eyes. We don't ever see that passage. So what we see is judgment that's taking place, evaluation that's taking place based on what she does, not necessarily how she looks doing it. I think that Boaz thought she was cute. I think that there was an attraction beyond just, well, this is a hard-working woman. But again, the scripture doesn't give any kind of description of her physically other than she was a very hard-working person. So she makes an impression on Boaz. Boaz certainly makes an impression on her. Right? Verse 20. Here's where we find out about the idea of kinsman redeemers. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and to the dead. So she counts the things that he's doing on their behalf for Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion. Right? This is Mahlon's wife, and he's doing great things for her in the absence of her husband. So he's serving the living and the dead. That man is our close relative. He is one, the NIV has guardian redeemers. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Then Ruth the Moabite said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all of my grain. So Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it would be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished. And she lived with her mother-in-law. So she's making sure that Naomi is okay. But Naomi is beginning to work on matchmaking to try to get this thing together. But not just for Ruth. Ruth is going to end up being the big winner here. But also because this is the kinsman redeemer. So there were levels, right? Let's say if Chilion had lived and Mahlon dies, then Mahlon's wife, Ruth, would have been his responsibility. He would have been responsible for marrying her, having children with her for Mahlon. They would have been Mahlon's offspring. They would have inherited his part of the property. But since both guys are dead, it goes to the closest family members. So if Elimelech had brothers, then it would go to those close relatives. And so the farther out it goes from the immediate family, the less chance you have of being redeemed, because the land needs to stay within the close clan, within the close family group. The fact that Boaz is a close family member means that he is at least somewhat available, maybe possibly the one to be available to take care of this. Look over at Leviticus 25, and we'll just kind of take a look at the first giving of this law. Leviticus 25:25. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells part of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. If, however, there is no one to redeem it for them, but later on they prosper and acquire sufficient means to redeem it themselves, they are to determine the value for the years since they sold it and refund the balance to the one to whom they sold it. They can then go back to their own property. If they do not acquire the means to repay, what was sold will remain in the possession of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. It will be returned in the Jubilee, and then they can go back to their property. So imagine if you're the landowner and say in year 25, you just can't do it anymore and you have to sell it off. You never get enough money to get it back. But 25 years later, in the year of Jubilee, here comes the deed, and they put you back on your property. So it's an amazing system, and God put it in place so that each family would always have a representation. They would always have that land that was originally given to them. The problem for Ruth and the problem for Naomi is that they don't have male representation at this point. The land is going to have to go away, and they just don't know what's going to happen to them in the long run if somebody doesn't step up and redeem this land. So they need a kinsman redeemer. We'll talk more about it next week, but it's not hard to draw the connection between the kinsman redeemer and the Messiah. Right? All of us were spiritually dirt poor. We'd lost it all. We were down to nothing. We were having to give away everything that we had. Our soul was in jeopardy. And yet, we have one who came and redeemed us, who bought us back, who gave us back the inheritance, right? We were meant to be God's children. We were meant to be his heirs. We were meant to be part of the heavenlies from the very creation of the planet when he put Adam and Eve on the planet. Humans were meant to have that relationship. But sin came into the world, and sin stole it all from us until our kinsman redeemer took on the form of a human being, lived and died as a human being, rose from the dead, and went back to the side of the Father so that we could be redeemed. So he gave the ultimate price to buy us back and to give us back the thing that God had given to us in the beginning.